The Nith Valley cuts through the southern uplands of Scotland like a natural boundary line, marking a region that's seen more than its share of conflict, power struggles and bloodshed. Sanquhar sits near the heart of this land, a town built on centuries of tension between clans, crowns and causes. Its story begins, at least in recorded history, with the rise of feudal power in the 13th century. Sanker Castle, now a weathered ruin, was once a vital military site. Built to command the road from Ayr to Dumfries, it overlooked the River Nith and guarded the western approaches to central Scotland. It passed into the hands of the Crichton family in the 14th century, but its military relevance had already been tested decades earlier during the Wars of Scottish Independence. In 1297, after a period of English control, Sir William Douglas is said to have recaptured the castle. According to some traditions, William Wallace himself joined forces in the region shortly afterwards, intercepting a retreating group of English soldiers and cutting them down in the Nith Valley. Some accounts claim several hundred were killed in a single encounter. By the late medieval period, the area around Sanquhar was part of a lawless zone known as the Western Marches, the borderlands between England and Scotland. These were not just administrative divisions, but regions defined by endemic raiding, retaliation, and feud. The Nith Valley was no exception. Families like the Crichtons of Sanquhar, the Maxwells of Caerlaverock, and the Johnstons of Annandale held power not only through land and loyalty to the crown, but through their capacity for retribution. Clan feuds became part of the life in the region. Cattle raids, ambushes, and retaliatory killings were routine. One of the most brutal conflicts in the wider area was the Battle of Drife Sands, fought near Lockerbie in December 1593. The feud between Clan Maxwell and Clan Johnston had reached a boiling point. Lord Maxwell raised a force to confront the Johnstons, but he was outmanoeuvred. The Johnstons, with support from other allied families, launched a sudden and devastating assault. Around 700 Maxwells were killed in the fight, and the desperate pursuit that followed. Lord Maxwell himself was shot and killed while trying to flee. The slaughter at Drife Sands sent shockwaves through southern Scotland and deepened an already bitter culture of revenge. Sanquhar sat within the orbit of that violence, tied to families on both sides of the border. But not all conflict in the area was clan-based. The 16th century also brought royal politics and religious turmoil. In 1568, following her defeat at the Battle of Langside, Mary, Queen of Scots, fled across the country. During her flight, she was briefly sheltered by the Crichton family at Sanker Castle. Her presence in the town brought it into the orbit of dynastic conflict at the highest level. And the Crichtons' decision to support Mary, even briefly, placed them in a dangerous political position as her enemies consolidated power. In the 17th century, the region became entangled in the religious strife that divided Scotland during the Covenanting period. The signing of the National Covenant in 1638 had committed many Scots to resisting the imposition of Anglican practices. The result was decades of tension and eventual warfare, culminating in what became known as the Killing Times. The Nith Valley became a hiding place for those resisting royalist authority. Sanquhar, remote enough to shelter and close enough to key roads to be symbolically important, was chosen as the site of two public declarations of rebellion. The first was in 1680, when Richard Cameron, leader of the radical Presbyterian group later known as the Cameronians, rode into Sanquhar with a small armed group. They nailed a declaration to the town's market cross, renouncing allegiance to Charles II, and proclaiming resistance in the name of true Presbyterian governance. This act was more than symbolic. It was an open challenge to the crown, delivered in public, under arms, in the middle of a Scottish town. Cameron would be hunted down and killed later that same month. The second declaration came in 1685, this time against James VII. Once again, it was made at the Sanker Cross, and once again, it placed the town at the heart of Scotland's religious resistance. These declarations were not acts of theatre. They carried a real risk, and in their aftermath, the region saw waves of reprisals, arrests, and executions. Even beyond these formal rebellions, the area was shaped by the quieter toll of suppression. Ministers were removed from parishes, families were fined, and gatherings of worshippers had to be held in secret. The hills and glens of Nithsdale sheltered these gatherings, and the memory of persecution became part of the landscape itself. Local traditions preserved the locations where Covenanters met or were caught, some of them near Sanquhar, others further along the Nith, or among the hills above Wanlock Head and Lead Hills. The 18th century saw the fading of clan power and the consolidation of royal control. But unrest never vanished entirely, and Sanquhar was not untouched by the Jacobite risings, though its involvement was limited compared to other regions. Instead, the next period of disruption came not from battle, but from industrialisation. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, coal mining began in earnest in the hills around Sanquhar. The town's location made it a useful centre for transportation and administration, and it grew in importance as a market town. With industrialisation came new forms of hardship: dangerous work, low wages, and rising mortality. Mining accidents and outbreaks of disease left their own mark. As always, the physical landscape of the Nith Valley absorbed the weight of human suffering. The past had shifted from swords and declarations to pit collapses and child burials, but the sense of hardship remained. The social shifts of the 19th century brought further changes. The construction of the railway linked Sanquhar more closely to the rest of the country, but the old ghosts remained. The remains of Sanker Castle stood as a reminder of a more violent time. The stories of Covenanters, clan feuds, and royal fugitives were passed on through oral tradition and local history. Many of the town's families carried names connected to these earlier chapters. Even today, the land around Sanquhar feels marked by its past. The hills are dotted with cairns, boundary stones, and old tracks once used by fugitives or troops. The river still cuts through the land as it always has, winding past the foundations of watchtowers, the remains of medieval churches, and abandoned settlements. The stories of the Nith Valley are not neatly arranged or closed off. They spill over time, from rebellion to ruin, from superstition to survival. The soil has seen loyalty and betrayal, exile and return, and in its folds are the places where people died for land, for power, or for faith. That weight never entirely lifts. The land's long history of conflict, betrayal and sorrow may be gone from the records, but in Sanquhar and the Nith Valley some say it's never truly left, only changed shape, glimpsed in moments where the past still presses close. They say she appears when the light begins to fade, just as the wind shifts through the shell of the old tower and the last of the sunlight pulls away from the crumbling stone. The White Lady of Sanker Castle is more than a rumour. For some, she's a reality. Her name, they say, was Marion of Dalpeddar, a young woman of noble birth, beautiful, doomed. In the year 1590, she entered Sanker Castle for the last time. Many people believed she was lured there under false pretences. Others believed she was already involved with Lord Robert Crichton of Sanker, a man whose power was matched only by his reputation for cruelty. Whatever the truth, she disappeared within those walls. No record of a funeral, no grave. And what followed was silence. The stories began years later, when a castle servant refused to climb the east stairwell after sunset. He claimed a woman stood at the top, silent, wringing her hands, blocking his path. The steward dismissed it as a trick of the shadows until it happened again and again. She's been seen many times since, always the same description: tall, pale, dressed in a flowing white gown. Her long blonde hair hangs loose around her shoulders. Her face is never clearly remembered. Witnesses describe a kind of mental blur, not because of fear, but it's as though their minds won't let them fully register what they're seeing. In 1876, during partial excavations around the castle walls, workers unearthed a shallow grave. The skeleton was that of a young woman. There was no coffin, no burial marker, but strangely a few strands of pale hair still clung to the skull. The body was then reinterred, quietly without ceremony, but after that the sightings increased. One of the earliest written accounts comes from 1901. A local school teacher visiting the site in the early evening saw a woman standing motionless in a ruined archway. He assumed she was another visitor. He cheerfully nodded in greeting, but she didn't respond. As he passed by her, a chill overcame him, a drop in temperature so sudden it stopped him in his tracks and caught in his lungs. He turned back, but she was gone. In 1933, a retired soldier who'd come to photograph the ruins described an encounter at dusk. He was adjusting his camera when he noticed movement in the upper window of the Great Hall. He thought it was a tour guide in costume. Then she raised her hands, slowly, to her face, and then he realised she was weeping. He called out, but there was no answer. He climbed the staircase, but the chamber was empty. The local guides have long said her presence is strongest in late autumn, especially on still nights. One elderly resident recalled a night in the 1950s when her dog refused to approach the castle. The animal lay flat on the ground, whining softly, ears pinned. The woman saw nothing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. There are those who claim the White Lady appears only before misfortune. One of the last Crichtons to reside in the area reported seeing her during a walk shortly before his brother's sudden illness. A visitor in the 1980s collapsed near the tower and claimed when they came to have seen a face like sorrow itself standing over him. But perhaps the most unnerving account comes from 2002. A group of amateur ghost hunters camped near the base of the castle. Around midnight, one of them left the tent to relieve himself. He returned pale, shaking. He claimed to have seen a woman standing at the top of the staircase, wringing her hands. She didn't vanish, she didn't float. She simply turned and stepped through the solid wall beside her. The group left before dawn. The question of who she was has never truly left local conversation. The discovery of the skeleton gave weight to what once had been campfire talk. Some believed Marion was pregnant with Crichton's child. Others recounted old gossip that she threatened to expose something. Theories grow in gaps history leaves behind. What does remain are the sightings. Not frequent, but consistent. Always the gown, always the gesture of the hands, always that sense of sorrow, not rage. And there's one final detail. Many who see her report something odd, a feeling not of fear, but of regret. as though in witnessing her they have stepped into someone else's grief. And even now, as the castle falls into further ruin, the White Lady of Sanker continues to be seen, and each time she is, the question rises again. What happened in those walls all those years ago that left a sorrow so deep it couldn't be buried? But the castle may not be the only place where she walks. There's another account, passed down over generations, of a woman seen weeping in the fields and along the hillsides outside Sanker. The story is said to date from the time of the Covenanters, when people were hunted for their faith and meetings were held in secret. According to this version, a young woman, unnamed in most accounts, betrayed her lover, a Covenanter fugitive, believing that he'd been unfaithful. She decided to give him up to authorities, only to learn that the rumours had been false. Eventually he was captured, and with some versions of the story saying he was hanged, others say he died in prison. What remains, though, is the grief. The stories that followed after say that she went mad with guilt, that she wandered the hills near Crawick, crying his name, that she died not long after, but not before locals began to speak of a pale figure walking the same path, forever wringing her hands. She's no face in the stories, only that gesture, and the sound of weeping on certain misty evenings. Some call her another White Lady, others think that she's the same. Whether two women or one, their sorrow seems to echo from the same wound, the kind that doesn't heal with time, only deepens. In the hills and at the ruins, they still see her. Not every haunting in Sanker begins with a mystery. Some begin with a name, a face, and a death, recorded plainly in history. But even then, the story isn't always what it seems. John Wilson was a servant caught in the crossfire of a bitter feud between two powerful men. In 1590, the same year Marion of Dalpeddar vanished, he was arrested, tried, and hanged. His name appears in local accounts, but the details surrounding his execution have long been the subject of rumour. Wilson had worked for Sir Thomas Kirkpatrick of Closeburn, a man of influence and strong local ties. But he also counted among his acquaintances another figure, Robert Crichton, Lord of Sanker. The same Robert Crichton whose name is mentioned in connection with the White Lady. At the time, Crichton was locked in a dispute with Kirkpatrick. Some say it began over land, others believe it was just personal. Whatever its cause, the quarrel became deadly, and John Wilson found himself in the middle. He was accused of a crime, though what crime exactly differs depending on who tells the story. Some versions say it was theft, others imply he was involved in something far darker, the disappearance of a young woman. One account suggests he knew too much, another that he was made an example. Sir Thomas defended him, standing by his man, but Crichton's influence proved greater. Wilson was sentenced and hanged. No appeal, no delay, just a swift execution to settle a wider grudge. They say his ghost has never left the castle. Witnesses describe hearing rattling chains in the east wing after dark, long after the rooms have emptied. A moaning sound, low and rhythmic, drifts through the ruined halls. Some claim to have seen a figure slumped near the base of the stairwell, rising slowly as if still bound. His presence is felt most strongly near the tower. A few who've dared to enter at night describe the air growing tight, the sense of being watched from the shadows, not with malice, but with sorrow and regret, as though something long denied still clings to the stone. What remains unclear is whether John Wilson was innocent. The traditional account paints him as a man crushed by powerful enemies, but another thread of local beliefs holds that he may have played a role in Marion's disappearance, that his silence, or worse, his complicity, was the reason he was silenced. The coincidence of timing has never sat easily. 2 lives ended in the same year, one lost in secret, the other publicly condemned. Some say the 2 hauntings are linked, that Marion weeps for what was done to her, and that Wilson, wherever he stands in the truth, remains caught in the aftermath. Neither mourned nor fully condemned, trapped in a story that still refuses to settle. Whatever the truth, his name has never left the ruin, and in Sanker, that says something. They called him the restless provost. Abraham Crichton had once held status in Sanker, a laird, a provost, a man of standing. But by the time of his death in 1745, whatever reputation he had built was in ruins. In 1741 he was declared bankrupt. Few believed it. Rumours spread quickly. Hidden gold, unpaid debts, deals gone wrong. He'd made enemies, and the town did not mourn him. He died on a stormy evening, thrown from his horse just outside town. Some believed he was drunk, others said the animal was spooked. A few claimed the devil had taken him by the shoulder. He was buried in Sanker kirkyard under a heavy stone slab. That should have been the end of it. Within a week, stories began. A young farmhand, walking past the kirkyard after sunset, saw a ghostly figure rise up from the ground behind the Crichton stone, a tall weathered slab bearing the family name. Terrified, he ran. The next night, the apparition was witnessed by 2 men, who returned home after fleeing the kirkyard, shaken. They said someone, or something, had chased them along the boundary, hissing, laughing. They ran and they didn't look back. Soon no one would pass the kirkyard after dark. The figure was always the same, tall, broad-shouldered, cloaked, a flash of white at the neck, as if from a formal shirt, and the grin. Witnesses described it again and again, fixed, unnatural, wide. Milkmaids dropped their pails at the sight of it. Horses refused to go near the east gate. A mason who'd stayed late repairing the church roof refused to return, telling the minister he had heard a voice from the shadows say his name. By the end of the month, even skeptics had begun to avoid the kirkyard. The town needed help. That help came in the form of Reverend Hunter of Penpont, a man of unshakable faith and, as it turned out, a taste for drama. He announced that he would spend the night in the kirkyard alone to confront what haunted it. He brought only a Bible and, at his side, a sword. Not a ceremonial one, but the blade he'd once carried during his years abroad. The villagers gathered before sunset, some praying, others simply waiting. When darkness came, Hunter stepped between the stones and disappeared into the night. What happened next was never fully documented. The Reverend would only say that he prayed, read aloud from scripture, and felt a malevolent presence press against the air around him. At one point he claimed a cold wind circled the Crichton grave, though the night itself was still. By dawn he emerged pale but unharmed. The ghost, he declared, was gone. But the townspeople weren't content to take chances. Later that week, under Hunter's guidance, several men returned to the kirkyard with iron. They forged thick chains across the provost's grave, bolting them into the slab. Not symbolic chains, real, heavy chains. Chains meant to hold something down. Whether they were needed is still debated, but after that night the sightings stopped. For over 200 years, the stories remain part of Sanker's local lore. The grave is still marked and still chained, and it draws the curious and the cautious alike. Some believe if you stand near it at dusk, you can hear laughter behind you. Others claim that the chain links are warm to the touch, even in winter. The tale of the restless provost is not told just as a ghost story, but as a warning. that some legacies don't end cleanly, and some men, even in death, can't let go of their power, and that sometimes a grave needs more than stone to keep what lies beneath from rising again. In the shadows of Crawick Water, just west of Sanker, there are places where the past doesn't feel far away. Among the twisting paths and moss-covered stones, one formation stands out, the Witch's Stairs. It's a natural outcrop, steep and layered like uneven steps, and for generations it was whispered to be the meeting place of something older than gossip, older even than memory. The people of Upper Nithsdale once called Crawick Mill the headquarters of the sisterhood. The 17th century brought witch hunts to Scotland with full force. Across the southwest, including Dumfries and the lands around Sanquhar, trials and executions became grimly routine. Records show that in 1659, 9 women were convicted and burned on the sands of Dumfries. Earlier in 1657, 2 others were executed. Expenses noted for tar barrels and stakes. Sanquhar itself has no surviving record of formal executions, but its silence may speak more of local justice than innocence. Parish records and oral traditions point to quiet disposals, accusations handled away from the courts, and one hill near the town still carries the name Stake Moss. It's in this climate of fear that the stories of Crawick's witches settled into local memory. They were blamed for all manner of misfortune. A cow would go dry, a mare would miscarry, a churn, no matter how long it was worked, would yield no butter. It was said that witches met at the Witches' Stairs after dark, gathering by river to plot, to chant and to dance. Some claimed they came in animal form, hares, cats, even birds. Others say that they flew there on the backs of the wind itself. The villagers didn't speak of it openly, but they didn't forget either. One of the most often told stories centres on Robert Stitt, the miller of Crawick Mill. According to the tale, an old woman came to him one day, asking for a measure of meal. She was poor, thin, and wrapped in a shawl. He turned her away, but as she left she looked back and said, "You'll rue it ere many days are past." A week later the river flooded. Stitt, caught returning late from work, was swept into the current and drowned. The villagers said little. They already knew what happened. In another story, a young man encountered a known witch on the path one morning. She looked at him and said simply, "You'll come riding hame the nicht." He laughed, but later that day he broke his leg falling from a cart. He was brought home in the back of the same cart, white-faced and silent. The last reputed witch of Crawick, a woman known only as Nanny, lived into the 1800s. She never denied the rumours, she seemed to enjoy them. Neighbours would leave her gifts, milk, eggs and butter, small offerings meant to keep her content. Many a present she got, an old farmer once said. No one wanted to be the target of her displeasure. Witchcraft, whether real or imagined, was not just a fear, but a framework. People read the world through it. When the butter wouldn't come, it wasn't just bad luck, it was someone's doing. And if there was blame, there had to be protection. The people of Sanquhar and Crawick developed ways of keeping witches at bay. Rowan branches were hung above the doors and in barns. Horseshoes were nailed to lintels. Juniper was burned in the hearth, and it was believed that crossing running water could break a spell. A churn carried across the River Nith might suddenly produce butter again. One minister, the Reverend Rankin, found his household's butter wouldn't come. Convinced a curse had been laid, he sent his servant, William McClatchy, to nail a spring of rowan wood above the door of a suspected witch in Crawick Mill. Whether it worked or not, the butter came shortly after. Not every measure was defensive. Some chose appeasement. When the minister's wife suspected their milk had been blinked, she sent a generous portion of butter to the old woman in Crawick. The milk flowed properly again, and no one questioned. Even into the 19th century, these practices continued. The rowan tree outside Sanker Church was said to have been planted to keep witches from entering. People lowered their voices when speaking of certain neighbours, and some paths were avoided after dark. Witch trials may have ended with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in 1736, but belief lingers longer than law. In the hills around Crawick, where mist clings low, and the linns roar after the rain, it's easy to feel why. The Witches' Stairs still stand. They are marked on few maps, but locals can point the way. Children are told not to climb them, not because they're dangerous, though they are, but because of what might be waiting at the top. And when a cow falls ill or a storm strikes out of season, there are still those who glance at the old houses near the water and wonder if Nanny had a hand in it after all. Not every ghost story from the Nith Valley takes the shape of a figure. Some hauntings remain in stranger forms. A little over 2 centuries ago, a pedlar set out across the upper Nithsdale landscape, carrying a bundle of goods and heading for Sanquhar. These travelling merchants were a familiar sight in rural Scotland, walking long distances with everything from needles and ribbons to shoe polish and trinkets. Their presence brought the outside world to the isolated farms and cottages, but this particular journey would be his last. Somewhere near Littlemark Farm, on the edge of the Elliot estate, the pedlar was set upon and murdered. His killer was never caught. Local talk suggested greed was the motive, a robbery turned violent. A large boulder near the track was marked out in later years as the site of the crime, and people began calling it the Deal Stone. For a while, the story of the murder faded. There was no grave to visit, no ghostly wailing in the night, just an empty space along a rural path. But then came the sightings. Walkers began to report something strange, a bundle like a tightly packed sack of goods, hovering several feet above the ground. It moved slowly along the track near the Deal Stone, keeping close to the route the pedlar may have taken. There was no figure carrying it, no footsteps, just the pack. Witnesses described it as unnatural, as if the very idea of the pack had taken on a life of its own. One farmer said it drifted past him like a balloon made of cloth and shadow. Another, coming back from market late in the day, saw it pass across the path and disappear into the trees. The dogs were said to growl at nothing. A few locals began taking alternate routes. There were never reports of sound. No whisper of fabric, no clinking buckles. Only the sight of the pack, moving without cause, unclaimed by any hand. In one account from the 19th century, a young shepherd mistook the bundle for a lost item and approached it. When he reached out, it vanished. Not with a burst or noise, but simply ceased to be. He refused to return to the path for weeks. The story was picked up by folklorists documenting the region. In their notes, the hauntings recorded not as a ghost, but as a presence, a remnant, the lingering memory of a wrong. In that lonely stretch of land near Sanker, where the wind moves through grass and past old stones, some say the pack still follows the path, waiting to finish its final journey. Across the British Isles, tales of phantom black dogs are common. Creatures said to appear without warning, eyes burning like coals, their presence heavy with dread. In the countryside around Sanquhar, the legend takes on a distinct shape. They say it haunts a stretch of rough path not far from Crawick water, a place where the light fades quickly and the trees close in. Local stories describe a huge black dog, low-slung and powerful, with fur wet like ash and eyes that catch the moonlight. It doesn't bark, it doesn't growl, just appears, follows, vanishes. One of the oldest accounts comes from a shepherd in the early 1800s, walking home after tending his flock. He first heard what he thought were footsteps behind him, then a low breath, not quite human. When he turned, the path was empty. Moments later, a shape passed beside him, large, dark, soundless. He didn't see it clearly, he only felt the movement and caught the glint of eyes. He ran the rest of the way home. Another encounter decades later came from a pair of boys walking to their uncle's farm after sunset. They spotted what they believed was a stray dog by the side of the track. As they approached it, it rose, larger than any dog they'd ever seen. One boy threw a stone, the stone passed through it. The dog didn't flinch. It stared at them for several seconds, then vanished into the shadows. For some, the black dog is said to be a warning. Several older residents recall that sightings would sometimes precede bad news. A farm accident, a sudden illness, a lost calf. Others believe it guards something, a hidden grave, a long-forgotten boundary, or perhaps nothing at all, but the memory of something violent. A local tale speaks of a woman who lived near Crawick in the late 19th century. She told her grandchildren never to take the lower path to Sanker after dark. When asked why, she said, "The dog walks there." She claimed her own brother had seen it during a storm, standing on a boulder above the Crawick burn, unmoving as thunder cracked overhead. Even today, a few walkers still mention a strange feeling near that same stretch, a weight to the air, a sudden silence in the trees. And one modern hiker described the sense of being watched, followed, though nothing could be seen. There is no single or simple explanation for the Crawick dog. A lot of people believe it's the spirit of a wronged animal. Others whisper of witches and guardians, of spirits tasked with patrolling old thresholds. The path it haunts is not marked on most maps, but ask the right person in Sanquhar and they might tell you where not to walk once the sun goes down. The phantom black dog of Crawick doesn't howl. It doesn't chase, it watches. And for those who've seen it, the memory is not one of fear alone, but of something older, something that was there long before they passed, and may still be there now. Not all hauntings come with spectacle. Some surface in passing, a glimpse at the edge of sight, a presence sensed rather than seen, a story told in half-remembered detail. Around Sanquhar in the Nith Valley, it's often what's said that lingers longest. The archives give us names and dates, but not always the full shape of what happened. The land holds the rest. Again and again, the same themes return. A missing body, an unmarked grave, a witness who saw something they couldn't explain, a face in despair, a weight carried, a promise broken. The past doesn't seem to always bury itself cleanly, and in these hills, what was left unresolved seems to echo, not as noise, but as a presence. These are the kind of stories that drew me to this subject in the first place. Not headline cases or famous hauntings, but local accounts, passed down, half-remembered, often on the edge of being lost. And one of the reasons I started this channel was to give these stories a space, to hold on to them a little longer. These stories may not always come with answers, but they ask questions that still feel worth listening to.